There are many different types of salespeople in American history. Car salesmen, traveling drummers, insurance solicitors, patent medicine men. The peddler is the most ubiquitous and the most general. Peddlers were a fixture in early American history. They traveled throughout the country. They sold goods like buttons or combs, rakes, even decorative artwork. Peddlers were especially important because America is such a huge and expansive country. They united the cities and the rural agricultural areas. Peddlers were also important because they introduced market culture to some of these rural areas. They bartered, they brought new goods, they actually recycled. They're early recyclers because they would take the used clothing, for instance, on a barter and sell it to someone who still needed it. Peddling, like almost all forms of selling, came with some embarrassment. Often peddlers were the people went into peddling because they couldn't find other work to do. Some people actually went into peddling because they saw a sense of adventure in it, but most of them were the second sons or immigrants or others who just couldn't find other work to do. So very early in American history there develops a folklore about peddlers in which they're portrayed as negative outsiders who would come to a community and trick people into buying things. Peddling, like almost all forms of selling, face negative stereotypes. The peddler very quickly in American history became the object of ridicule in Yankee folk tales, where the peddler was almost always portrayed as an outsider who came to town and tricked people into buying things that they didn't want to buy. Throughout the 19th century, peddlers become the subject of stories by Herman Melville and Mark Twain. Melville writes about a lightning rod salesman. Twain also writes about a lightning rod salesman. They're both dishonest figures. The lightning rod salesman would work his trade in the following way. He would come to a house. He would sell them the lightning rod for a fairly cheap price. But he would also give them a contract to sign, and the contract would include a very exorbitant price for the connecting wire. So when he put up the lightning rod, he would then use as much wire as he possibly could to connect it to the ground. So in Twain's story, Twain is busy writing a book. The lightning rod salesman comes to the door. Twain doesn't want to be disturbed. So he just tells the lightning rod salesman to go ahead and put in the lightning rod. A few hours later he comes down. The lightning rod has been installed, not only on the house, but on all the livestock, on the trees, on the dog's house, and binding it all to the ground are miles and miles of connecting wire. That's the typical lightning rod salesman's ploy. In Peddler's Diaries, they talk about how they were bringing new goods. They talked about how they introduced farmers to new conveniences. They talked about how they were uniting the country by selling the same types of goods throughout. But the real effort to improve the image of the salesman comes with the drummers or traveling salesmen in the late 19th century. They want to get rid of this whole image of being a peddler. They want to promote the salesman as a figure of sobriety, which in fact they aren't. The drummer is employed by wholesale companies to sell to the drummer is employed by wholesale companies to sell to corner stores and to general goods stores throughout the country. They're the ones who stock these stores with everything from candy to dry goods to alcohol to produce. And so their interests are quite different from the peddlers. The peddler is someone who operates transactionally. The peddler wants to come to town, make a quick sale, and leave. The drummer is looking to do something quite different. The drummer wants to establish long-term, year-after-year relationships with the store owner. These two types of selling really distinguish, are archetypical of two different approaches. One is transactional, the other is relationship-oriented. And they're very different types of work. The clock is a very interesting item in the history of American salesmanship because the clock is really one of the first new items that salesmen promote throughout the nation. Following the clock come the sewing machine, the refrigerator, the vacuum cleaner, and then early automobiles are also sold door to door, especially the Chevrolet model. So the clock is important because it sets this precedent for what comes next. Eli Terry was a Connecticut clock manufacturer. He was born just prior to the American Revolution and lived to the mid-19th century. He was one of several clockmakers operating in the area around Hartford, Connecticut. He invented a way to mass manufacture clocks using water power to run his factories. By the early 19th century, he and his son, also Eli Terry Jr., were making thousands of clocks per year, and they employed canvassers to sell them throughout the nation. Often they were farmers as well, so they would be home from the spring through the fall. They would go out to sell clocks in the autumn and return in the spring. The clock peddler is interesting to me in part because they introduced this new invention throughout the country, but also it's one of the earliest to be parodied. The character of Sam Slick becomes a popular fictional representation of the salesman in the 1830s. And Sam Slick is a notoriously mischievous and tricky character. Sam Slick is the creation of the Canadian author Thomas Halberton. These Sam Slick stories were very popular in the United States. Sam Slick would do things like showing up at a farmhouse. He would tell the farmer that he just wanted to store a clock there for a few months, not intending to sell it. He would put it on the wall and start it. When he came back a few months later, he knew that they would have to keep it. No, they didn't give up control. For the most part, the peddlers were selling on commission. And often in some of these cases, the peddlers actually had to buy the clocks themselves that they sold. Now, if you're selling something that you've already purchased, you sell it to someone as an order. You then need to go back and collect the money from them at some point in the future. And that's often how they operated, which made the clock salesman very aggressive in collecting the fees because they were already in debt to the company once they sold the clock. Patent medicine salesmen are interesting because they invent a new way of selling, which is the mass sales meeting. In a way, it's like today's variety show, in which during the commercial breaks they advertise products. Well, patent medicine salesmen would do the same thing. They'd have pie-eating contests or variety shows or musicals, and then when the entertainment stopped, they'd talk about their medicine. A lot of the patent medicine contained a degree of alcohol, so it was a proper way to consume alcohol. A lot of the patent medicine salesmen got their start by serving soldiers on the battlefield. In the years after the Civil War, they then went out and tried to sell all sorts of remedies for listlessness or coughing fits or anything else under the sun. Most people think the term drummer came from the idea that they drummed up trade. The drummer was a very popular figure in the American economy and the American society from the late 19th century through the early 20th century, and drummers still exist today. The drummer simply means someone who works for a wholesaler. Throughout most of the 19th century, manufacturers didn't sell their own products. Instead, they would sell them to wholesalers who then employed drummers to sell them throughout the country. Drummers traveled around, often spending months on trains, taking orders from country stores and sending them back to their wholesalers to be filled. The drummer was quite a different figure from the peddler. The drummer tended to be married, tended to be older, tended to be more educated.
I think you also mentioned in your book that they were very personality driven. Why was that?
So the focus of the drummer is quite different from the peddler. The drummer really is focused on forming long-term relationships with shop owners. Therefore, the drummer is very amiable. Sometimes the drummer will come to your store and won't sell you anything. Just ask you how you're doing, just ask you how business is. Next time he comes by, he might get a little business from you. That's what the drummer's all about. Therefore, one of the things that I found interesting in researching the book is that people have all these stories about traveling salesman jokes. And people normally think that traveling salesman jokes are about traveling salesmen and farmers' daughters. But there's another side to the story. If you read the history of drummers in the late 19th and early 20th century, you see a lot of books being, a lot of joke. If you look at the history of drummers, you see a lot of joke books being published in the late 19th and early 20th century that are written for drummers. These are jokes that they could memorize and tell shop owners and thereby gain their friendship. Using humor was a good way to form a relationship.
Excellent, thank you.
The drummer also gains a reputation for drunkenness and for womanizing. In part, I suppose this is because they spent so long on the road and in hotels. Their lifestyle was one in which they traveled from town to town, and I'm sure it was extremely lonely. Often drummers would get together themselves and they'd drink.